Hey everyone, and welcome to War Thunder 101. Today we'll be taking a look at the M6A1, a Rank 3 heavy tank of the United States. It's a tank with a curious history, and ultimately it never saw combat, nor did it even leave US soil. But like many other prototype or quote-unquote failed tanks, it leads a more successful life in War Thunder as the first heavy tank that most players unlock in the US tech tree. The M6A1 was born out of a heavy tank program implemented by the United States. At the outbreak of the Second World War, America had very few tanks and no dedicated heavy tanks. Though they had no intention of being dragged into the war, it would have been foolhardy for the US to not pursue new tank designs. In 1940, the US started work on a 50-ton heavy tank design. It was designated the Heavy Tank T1. The original proposed design was a multi-turreted tank inspired by the European designs of the 1920s and 1930s, when multi-turreted tanks were trending harder than the rise of fascism. It had four turrets, two mains, and two secondaries. The main turrets each held a low-velocity T6 75mm gun. One of the secondary turrets held a 37mm gun with a coaxial machine gun, and the other turret held a 20mm gun with a coaxial machine gun. On top of this, there were four 30 caliber machine guns that were installed in ball mounts, two on the glacis plate and two at the rear. It was insanity. Thankfully, like the Europeans, the Americans soon realised that this sort of design was a silly and wasteful idea, eventually opting for a single turret model instead, though they still got away with sticking an extra gun on the thing. It was designated the T1E1 prototype. The first T1E1 was delivered to the Army in December of 1941. From 1941 to 1942, 3 prototypes were built. One with electric transmission and two with torque converter transmission. Variants with hydromatic transmission were never completed. The prototypes also differed in hull assembly. One had a welded hull and two had cast hulls. Sadly, by the time development had settled on a production model, the Armoured Corps had lost interest in the model, and the M6 heavy tank was fast becoming obsolete. Not only that, but reports had been critical of the awkward and inefficient crew stations, the tank's high profile, and its now superfluous secondary 37mm gun. Eventually the tank was cancelled, with only 40 units having been built, and none of them ever saw combat. Bit of a sad ending, really. Putting aside the anticlimactic story of the tank, let's take a look at its stats regarding War Thunder. It's a Tier 3 heavy tank, sitting at a battle rating of 4.7 across arcade, realistic and simulator battle modes. It has 6 crew members: a commander, gunner, 2 loaders, driver and machine gunner. 3 members occupy the turret, and the other 3 are at the front of the tank. The rear of the tank is taken up completely by the enormous bulk of the Wright G200 engine and its transmission. The engine produces an impressive 708 horsepower at 2300 RPM, which allows the tank a brisk top speed of 35 km an hour. Not bad for a tank that weighs almost 57 tons. Its armour is interesting. Yes, let's call it that. In some places it is very good indeed, but there are some glaringly obvious weak points that a savvy opponent can and will exploit. Let's take a look at the good bits first. The frontal armour is good, and will more often than not bounce 76mm Panzer IV shells at range of 1000 meters or more. Direct hits on the mantlet will need to go through near enough 300mm of armour to penetrate. The lower glacis plate is also reasonably protected, as is the turret itself. Be wary though that you are still vulnerable to hits on the MG port and the driver's viewing port. Roof armour is quite good at 25mm, which will stop 50 cals and most 20mm rounds, but will still be vulnerable to larger guns like the 37mm cannon found on the Yak-9T. Though the M6A1 has good frontal and top armour, that is where the praise ends, sadly. The side armour is only 44mm thick, leaving you dangerously vulnerable to being ammo-racked if your opponent knows where to aim, and those large fuel tanks in the rear make for a juicy target as well. The rear armour is even worse, sitting at 41mm, which means that you'll be disabled if an enemy tank so much as sneezes at the rear end, but that's not the worst bit. No, the worst bit are these cheek-like panels at the front. Sure, they might be 82mm thick, but they're angled, which means that no matter how you angle the front of this tank, you will still be presenting the enemy team with a flat surface to fire upon. A direct hit here can knock you out, so it's best to keep the tank facing your opponent and take advantage of its strong frontal armour. Where the M6A1 may trip up with its unique armour design, it more than makes up for it with firepower. Its main gun is the same 76mm M7 cannon that is found on the M10 tank destroyer, which means you should be able to penetrate the front plate of most tanks you come across, depending on your ammo loadout. Speaking of which, you have 3 ammunition types for the main gun. You have the M62 shell, which is APC-BC and offers 106mm of penetration at 1000 meters if aimed at a flat surface. You then have the M79 shot, which is straight AP. This should be used only at close ranges of less than 500 meters, as its penetrative power drops off harshly after that. At point blank range, it can penetrate up to 150mm of armor. The final shell is the M42A1, which is a high explosive shell which should only really be used against soft targets. It's not going to do anything against armor. The secondary gun is a 37mm M3 cannon. This fast-firing little gun is best used against lightly armoured targets, where the larger 76 gun would probably be wasted. However, you could also use it in conjunction with the main gun, perhaps using the smaller rounds to disable the enemy's engine, and then using the main gun on the now stationary target. The 37mm M3 cannon also has a similar firing arc to the main gun, so they can be fired simultaneously if you're feeling indulgent. With the M3 cannon you also have a choice of 3 shells. The M74B1 is an AP shell that's best used at ranges of less than 500 meters, much like the shot for the main gun. The M51B1/B2, boy is that a mouthful, is a decent APC-BC that will offer slightly better penetration at longer ranges. And then you have the M63 high explosive, again which should only be used against soft targets. Now that we have the armament out of the way, let's have a look at some of the tactics best applied for using this tank. The M6A1 is fast for a heavy tank. This allows you a fair amount of independence, as you won't necessarily need to rely on faster tanks to provide support on your flanks. However, this tank absolutely excels when in a team. You can keep up with your other teammates and act as a vanguard for your assault, using your heavy frontal armour to soak up damage whilst returning fire with the 2 main guns. Focus your attacks on the heavier tanks on the opposing team. Remember, you've got the barrel from the M10, which can often one-hit kill Panzer IVs, T-34s, KV-1s and other sturdier tanks. Be sure to keep an eye on your flanks, as the M6A1 is a very tall tank and makes for a very big target. When possible, use buildings to shield your weaker side armour and take advantage of the terrain where possible. If you need to angle your armour, don't overdo it, as you will risk exposing those diagonal cheek plates to your opponent. Another thing of note is to beware the reverse gear of this tank. The M6A1 may be fast in a straight line, going forward, but its reverse speed is woeful and can leave you in a tight spot. Being a battle rating 4.7 tank, you run the risk of a full up tier into 5.7, where you will encounter high velocity 75mm guns and the 88mm gun of the Tiger. These guns will penetrate your frontal armour, so a direct confrontation with those tanks is not advised. If you find yourself up tiered, place yourself more in a support role. The 76mm gun will still be effective at this battle rating, but it will be even more so if you're able to flank an unsuspecting opponent whilst they are busy engaging the heavier tanks on your team. Also remember to use your speed to your advantage. it's harder to hit a moving target rather than a stationary one, and you do not want to be stationary when facing off against Tigers and Panthers. Those guns hurt. On the flip side, if you are the up tier, things are obviously easier. In a game predominantly populated with battle rating 3.7 and 4.0 tanks, you can go about with relative impunity, so long as you don't leave your flanks too exposed. Even at a lower battle rating, the fairly low amount of armor on your sides is going to leave you in a bit of strife if anything shoots you. Most tanks won't be able to penetrate that frontal armor, however, so keep that facing them, bulldoze into them, and take them out with your double barrel turret. Overall, and despite its quirks, I quite like the old M6A1, and for that I'm going to give it a solid rating of 7 out of 10. Some good points. It's got a fantastic main gun, great power to weight ratio, strong frontal armor, its sheer size increases the chance of surviving a hit, and it has a rear mounted transmission, so hits from the front won't instantly immobilize it. Some of the bad points: the weird cheek armor makes it vulnerable and nigh on impossible to angle, the crew is tightly packed in, making it easier to take out several key members at once, it's horrible in reverse gear, the side and rear armor is mediocre at best, and the engine makes for a big, flammable target. If it didn't have that awkward cheek armor at the front and maybe a little more side armor, it would easily be an 8 out of 10, but that's how it goes. I hope you enjoyed this video on the M6A1 heavy tank. Any and all feedback is always welcome. The next War Thunder 101 video will be focusing on an aircraft, but which one? You'll just have to wait and see. I do take requests as well, so if there is a particular vehicle or aircraft or ship you want covered, please let me know and I will endeavour to do it for you. Until then, this has been another War Thunder 101 video. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.